Welcome to our March first Wednesday. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Tonight we're hearing about Jane Austen. Somebody asked me, do you think there are a lot of fans in Brattleboro? I said, I think so. So I'm delighted that you can come out on this sort of soupy evening. And of course, we have many people to thank for this evening. The Vermont Humanities, first and foremost, for giving us this wonderful series of lectures that we enjoy every first Wednesday in Brattleboro. And in addition to that, we have other underwriters. We have Chroma Technology, the Crosby Gannett Fund of Vermont Community Fund of the Vermont Community Foundation, Merchants Bank, University of Vermont Humanities Center, VPR, and then our local underwriters, the Brattleboro Camera Club, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Downs Racklin Martin, LLC, the Richards Group, World Learning, and tonight's particular program is underwritten by Merchants Bank, right across the street, so aren't we lucky? Of course, there is no way that this series could happen without the support of your friends and mine, the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. So I know many of you in the audience are friends. If you are not yet a friend and you'd like to join this august group, it's very, very easy. We can make that happen. Just let us know afterwards. And then, finally, we have among us one of our VHC, the Vermont Humanities Council underwriters. We have Carol Gaddis, who is a loyal attendee and an underwriter for this program, and she's going to introduce our speaker tonight. So, Carol, would you like to come up?
Good evening. I'm Carol Gaddis, and I'm pleased to introduce Suzanne Brown this evening. Suzanne is a visiting assistant professor at Dartmouth College and has led Vermont Humanities Council and New Hampshire Humanities Council book discussions for over 30 years. Focusing on 19th and 20th century American and English literature, she holds a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. She has published her own short fiction and articles on the short story form. She was a Fulbright Scholar to Germany and received a fiction writing grant from the New Hampshire Arts Council. For the past 20 years, Suzanne has taught in the Dartmouth Humanities program, lecturing frequently on Jane Austen. Welcome.
This is a watercolored version of one of the very few pictures that we have of Jane Austen from the time when she was alive. It's sort of a reworked, colored-in version of a very sketchy sketch that her sister Cassandra did of Jane Austen. I put it up both because I like it and just to talk a little bit about the overall structure of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And what I want to do is to put Jane Austen in historical context. Two sides to that. One is historical and political, the events that were actually going on at the time that she was writing. And the second, which is intimately related, is the cultural context, the other writers who were writing, and the intellectual currents that were circulating during the time that Jane Austen was writing, specifically the Romantic movement. And when I say the Romantic movement, I'm talking about the Romantic movement with a capital R and a capital M. And I'm going to end the talk tonight by looking at romantic values, the way that Jane Austen both, I think, critiques those values, but also adopts them to some degree in her last novel, Persuasion. And I want to contrast her treatment of romantic values and ideas with the same way that those themes are treated in a very famous novel that's both a forerunner of the Romantic movement and a work that deeply influenced it, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. this is just a reminder of some of the historical events that took place during Jane Austen's lifetime. Jane Austen was born in 1775, 1 year before the American Revolution. She truly lived in revolutionary times. That, of course, was followed in fairly rapid succession by the revolution in France. And it's difficult to underestimate the intense effect of the French Revolution in England. Particularly at its beginning, many of the writers and intellectuals were inspired by its more idealistic aspects, the goals of equality and a fairer and more just society. Very quickly, of course, many people in England, and even some of the writers and intellectuals who had been inspired by it, were frightened and appalled by the reign of terror and the way that it turned bloody. But particularly at the beginning, the sense of this as something that was so revolutionary that would just utterly change things forever it's difficult to imagine now just how complete this was. The writer Robert Southey said, "All things seemed to be passing away, and nothing was dreamt up but the regeneration of the human race." In Paris in 1792, they renamed the year as the year one because everything was changing. Everything would be different from now on. Of course, in England, reformers like William Godwin foretold a redistribution of property on an equal basis. It's the sense of revolution and change and equality spilled over into gender relations. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which asserted that women had intellectual capacities as great as men's. That was a truly revolutionary idea. And that they should have greater educational and social rights. So it was inspirational in the beginning in England, but very quickly, for many people, soured and became frightening. The French Revolution, as you know, morphed into the Napoleonic years, in which England is in war with France. And then, of course, in England itself, from 1811 to 1820, which is some of the time when Austen is writing her major novels, we talk about the Regency period in England. George, the Prince of Wales, was acting as the regent for the insane George III. And it was a time of good times and spending and loosening of moral standards in London. However, Jane Austen, as you well know, most of her novels are set in the provinces. They are set at some remove from London, and indeed, when her characters go to London or to the cities, usually it's a sign that their morals are in trouble. There is money flowing into England, which I'll talk about more later, from the Napoleonic Wars. Those who were fighting Napoleon, when they took, particularly in the Navy, and I'm going to talk a lot about the Navy and its presence in Austen's last novel, Persuasion, they got prize money. So you could be a naval officer or even serve on a naval ship because the prizes were allocated proportionally to those on the ship. And you could make a lot of money. And that money, as happens now in Southern California with the .com, it bid up real estate prices, it influenced things. All of this money that you could earn through being in the Navy and attacking the ships of the enemy, taking them as prizes, and being awarded part of the proceeds. On the other end, so the traditional land-holding gentry are confronting another source of wealth and standing and status in society with this money that's flowing in. On the other side, there's a lot of ferment from the working class. There's a lot of upheaval, part of it inspired in the beginning through the French Revolution. A lot of the writers of the time, the Romantic writers, are very sympathetic to these working class movements, culminating in the 1819 Peterloo massacre of working class protesters because of displacement and working conditions. And poets like Shelley were very sympathetic to these workers who were fired on, actually, by government troops, and probably about 10 people were killed. But the French Revolution was really a crisis for intellectuals at the time. I think a good analogy, or one that at least serves to make it clearer to me, might be what happened for left-leaning intellectuals during the Stalin era. A lot of sympathy and inspiration for the ideals, but then having to confront a lot of bloodletting and what was actually happening. So it was quite a intellectual crisis for many writers. And then, of course, the French Revolution is followed by Napoleon's aggression. In fact, there was a tremendous fear of invasion from France and England during this period. And of course, most of Jane Austen's, her home with her clerical family, and many of her novels are set in southern England, and that would have been the place that was most likely a site for invasion from France. This is a poster from the time, and you can see the red hat here, which is the revolutionary symbol of the French Revolution. You notice the floating head in the blood. Back here you see the aristocrats who are being hung. And these fears, I see many smiles. It may seem a little comic now. These were very real fears. The French had just put up one of the first hot air balloons, and there was a feeling that they might cross the channel massively in hot air balloons. The other idea was the notion, and Napoleon actually did consider this, building a tunnel underneath the English Channel and invading that way. But as this suggests to you, these fears of invasion were very real. This poster is from 1796. Now, with all of this going on, and I hope I've conveyed to you just how full of ferment and upheaval and historical turmoil this period is, this is the period when Austen is publishing most of the works that we know. Sense and Sensibility, 1811, Pride and Prejudice, 1813, Mansfield Park, 1814, Emma, 1816, Northanger Abbey, largely written 1798 to 9, and Persuasion, published posthumously in 1817. Well, since Jane Austen, as you know, seems to write novels that mainly concern the interactions of a small group of provincial gentry, their personal relations and interactions, their concerns and their marriages, at least when I started college, which I have to admit was quite a while ago, my Norton anthology, which was the sort of received wisdom, had this to say: Jane Austen is the only important author who, untouched by the political, intellectual, and artistic revolutions of her age, stayed serenely within the culture and the literary traditions of the neoclassic past. Charlotte Brontë, of course, writing later, Victorian, writing Jane Eyre, had very little use for Jane Austen. She said the passions are perfectly unknown to her, and described her as a carefully fenced, highly cultivated garden with neat borders and delicate flowers. Not revolutionary, very uninterested in all of the ferment, the turmoil, all of the revolutions in literature and in values that are happening in her world. Jane Austen herself, I suspect, contributed herself a bit to this image of her. She made a very famous remark that's often quoted to a nephew, talking about her work. This little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush, talking about her writing as miniature, small, concerned only with personal relations, a few little neighbors, completely uninvolved with the turmoil in her time. And the lack of direct references to in none of her novels is there, or her letters, is there any reference to the French Revolution. There are a few oblique, there's a presence of a military in many of her works. Those of you who know Pride and Prejudice know the military is very much there. Persuasion is very much about the Navy. I'm going to talk about that towards the end. So the military is there. She makes a few oblique references that you could sort of say have something to do with the Napoleonic War, but really not very much. This is particularly unusual given that her beloved brothers, 2 of them were prominent naval officers fighting Napoleon. Charles, and then Francis. This is a younger version of Francis, and an older version. He rose to be quite prominent in the Navy. So he was very prominent in fighting during the Napoleonic Wars. So of course these were major I'm sure, sources of conversation and of interest and of concern. Jane Austen herself was extremely proud of her brothers. So that it's very obvious that she's not unaware of these events and that they're of real concern to her. Even more, she had a cousin, Eliza, whose first husband was actually killed. He was guillotined in the French Revolution. So, of course, that was a major source of sadness in the family. And indeed, Eliza went on to marry another one of Jane Austen's brothers. So the French Revolution even had a personal effect within her family. And that makes the lack of specific reference to these major historical events perhaps even more noticeable and deliberate, since personally within her family she was deeply touched by those events. That's the historical context. But there was an accompanying revolution in culture and in literature. The Romantic movement at the beginning of the 19th century, and I'm going to paint this in very broad strokes here because I have to. There are ways in which this is overstating things in some instances, but I'm trying to give a broad sense of difference. The Romantic movement at the beginning of the 19th century tended to emphasize feeling and emotion, imagination, memory, the individual, and man in isolation and in nature. And in some ways, that was a revolution against the values that had predominated in literature earlier in the 1700s, in the 18th century, what's called the neoclassical period. That the Romantic movement was reacting in part to the 18th century with its neoclassical emphasis on tradition, social decorum, rationality, moderation, restraint, and man in society. So Jane Austen was seen as a kind of throwback. All of these things are happening around her. The Romantic poets are seeking out new values that are very different. And there is Jane Austen, supposedly writing about the same social decorum, the same good manners, the same lack of change that has predominated earlier in the 18th century. Again, as I said, these are very broad strokes. Changes don't happen overnight. They're prepared for. We talk for example, about revolution in the 1960s. We all know there were the beatniks in the 1950s. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen on the date of 1960 either. So even before the full-blown Romantic movement, there were many Romantic precursors. There was the novel of feeling. So this was a long time in coming. But nonetheless, Jane Austen is seen as not participating in the major cultural and intellectual currents of her time, but as being a throwback to the values of an earlier era. And I'm just going to put up the writers who are her contemporaries to suggest to you just how different the world that she's writing about at least can seem to be. There's the quite revolutionary and Romantic precursor poet William Blake that I'll be talking about a little bit more later in the lecture. I'm sure you're familiar with William Wordsworth and Coleridge. Their preface to lyrical ballads in 1798 was part of what ushered in the revolution in poetry and in the Romantic movement, so that in fact the emphasis on the feelings of the poet, the feelings of the creator, and an emphasis on nature are part of coming in with Coleridge and Wordsworth. Byron and Shelley are the younger generation of and Keats, the younger generation of Romantic poets. Byron, of course, you know as probably as the creator of what was called the Byronic hero, the dark, lonely, misunderstood figure who has usually suffered a loss of his great love and a wrong, and so is a very dangerous dark figure and not part of society. He's the forerunner of many later dark heroes like Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre, but that's Byron. As I suggested, there's a certain political cast to their writings as well. Shelley was deeply concerned with revolution and with working class protest. Mary Wollstonecraft, as I mentioned, is writing and suggesting a revolution in gender relations. There's the Gothic novel, which those of you who know Jane Austen's the first novel that she wrote, not the first novel that she published, Northanger Abbey, is a satire on Gothic novels. And whereas often Jane Austen is praised for just writing very well about the small motions of everyday, ordinary life. The books that people were reading and gobbling up were Gothic novels that were full of sensational events, uncommon events, heroines threatened, wandering in dark castles, opening caskets. And Jane Austen made fun of these, but she also read them, and they were wildly popular. But again, you can see how different Jane Austen's writing is. She's not writing about these sensational events. Sir Walter Scott, those of you who know Ivanhoe, set back in the medieval era, again, writing about very uncommon events and daring do. And last of all, Goethe, who I will be talking about his Sorrows of Young Werther, which in many ways ushered in, was a precursor of the Byronic hero, and I'll be talking about that more later in the lecture. But Jane Austen herself, the popular novels of the time, a typical one, for example, the heroine travels from Scotland to London, is kidnapped, endures a perilous sea crossing to Canada, eventually escapes by canoe from a band of American Indians. So they're exotic. This is not what Jane Austen writes about. Jane Austen said, I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I'm sure I should be hung before I had finished the first chapter. So she knew that her writing was like earlier 18th century works. She was interested in holding the mirror up to ordinary life. That had been the goal earlier in the 18th century, not to express the unusual and the exotic sensations of a creator. So just to recap, but to suggest what I'm going to be arguing throughout the evening, there is this view of her as celebrating the earlier 18th century virtues of tradition, social decorum, rationality, moderation, and above all, restraint, containing your emotions properly, versus the romantic emphasis on the overflow of emotion, the spontaneous eruption of feeling. The individual in romantic isolation rather than in society and the imagination. This way of looking at Jane Austen presents her as a social conservative, particularly because she did come from a family whose sympathies had been largely Tory, associated with the values of the landholding class in England. And oblivious to the larger political currents of her time beyond the narrow concerns of a tiny circle of provincial gentry. But I think it's probably more correct to see Austen as engaging with the romantic ideas and entering into a dialogue with her contemporaries on these issues. So here is Jane Austen writing in the midst of this ferment of the romantic poets. And many people, like Charlotte Brontë later, view Jane Austen as too moderate and cautious to understand real feeling and passion. But what I'd like to do to question that view is to take a look now very closely at a romantic precursor and major influence on the romantic poets, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, alongside Jane Austen's last novel, Persuasion. And I'm going to start by looking at the treatment of children in those two works. Why children? In the 18th century, the notion that prevailed generally was that children should be properly civilized. They should be restrained, they should be disciplined, and they should be taught by adults to be good members of society. The writers of the Romantic movement, on the other hand, tended to romanticize children and to believe that children showed a natural, uncivilized state that was in many ways superior to the state of adults who had been corrupted by the social world. And so that, in fact, adults should learn from children rather than children learning from adults. It's interesting, these are older ideas, but I think we still have vestiges in them of both trends when we look at children. I'm sure many of you have had moments of looking at a child and thinking how unspoiled they are and how much there is to admire. I'm sure you've also had moments of engaging with children and feeling that they are somewhat primitive creatures whose desires need very much to be obtained. But of course, this kind of touchstone of the attitude towards children tells you quite a lot about the values of the era. I'm going to summarize the plots a little bit. Both Persuasion by Jane Austen and The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe concern lovers who seem to have a hopeless love. Werther falls in love with Lotte, who is already engaged and who in fact later marries. But Werther is deeply attached to Lotte. He cannot get over this. He wanders throughout the natural world. He goes for a while. He tries to get a job at the court and is humiliated in the corrupt society. And eventually he kills himself because of his hopeless love for Lotte. It is impossible to describe the effect of this novel at the time. All across Europe and in England, young people put on the clothes that were the same colors that Werther wore. A rash of suicides was attributed to Werther. Napoleon carried this book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, with him on his campaigns. It was wildly influential. Goethe kept revising it. Another edition came out later, and it continued just to be an extremely important work. Persuasion seems to be extraordinarily different, but it too is a novel about a blocked and hopeless romance. Persuasion, as you may well know, concerns Anne Elliot, who has fallen deeply in love with Wentworth when they were young, but who has given him up, at least temporarily, because her mother died when she was young, and her mother's friends advises her to do this because Wentworth doesn't have enough money to support her at the time. And regretfully, Anne does this because she feels she should be persuaded by her mother's friend. Well, Wentworth goes off. He goes into the Navy, and he makes a lot of prize money. But he is very angry that she has given him up and been weak as he sees her. So the novel opens when he comes back 7 years later, prepared to have absolutely nothing to do with Anne, because he is so angry with her for having given him up. Anne is still very deeply in love with him, but they hardly are, at the beginning, are even going to speak. But she is still very much in love with him, and he is, at the moment, so angry with her, he doesn't want to have anything to do with her. But in both cases, these hopeless lovers bond over children. In The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, Werther says, children are closer to my heart than anything on earth. And he sees in these tiny creatures the germ of all virtues. He regrets that adults treat children as inferiors, and he says that we should regard children as our models. Adults should learn from children, not the other way around. And in fact, when he first meets Lotte, she is cutting bread and butter for this group of children that she, in her family, that she looks after. And they're a kind of charming backdrop. She is there. They love her. 6 children from 11 to 2 years of age, swarming about a girl with a beautiful figure. So they're very generic children. They're a kind of pretty backdrop. Lotte is cutting bread and butter for them, for which an attention that they will accept only from her and significantly later from Werther. And Werther's main interaction with the children is to kiss a little boy with an adorable face and a runny nose, and to beg for the 2 older boys the indulgence of riding behind on the carriage to do exactly what they want to do. Austen's treatment of children in Persuasion, her 2 lovers meet for the first time too in the presence of children. But these are not just generic children in Persuasion. They're highly specific children. Nor are they as charming as the children in Werther. While Anne is attending to one of her sick nephews, her other nephew, quote, a remarkably stout, forward child of 2 years old, made his determined appearance among them and put in his claim to any good that might be giving away. And not finding anything good to eat, and since Anne will not let him tease his sick brother, he began to fasten himself upon her. Once she did contrive to push him away, but the boy had the greater pleasure in getting on her back again directly. Walter, she said, get down this minute. You are extremely troublesome. I am very angry with you. And this, he doesn't obey her. But Wentworth, who is at this point has hardly spoken to her in the novel, he's still very angry with her. But what he does is he comes and takes the child off of her back without speaking to her. But I bring all of this up to show you how both authors put the meeting of their star-crossed lovers in the presence of the children. But the relation to the children is extraordinarily different, even though there are things in common. Now, in fact, this Anne says, I'm very angry with you. Actually, she loves her nephews. And she is actually very loving to children, but she shows her love in a very, very different way from Werther, who is mainly seeking to learn from them and to give them indulgences. Anne shows her love for her nephew, particularly her sick nephew, by the tedious task of trying to entertain a sick child in bed, which is not an easy thing to do. Moreover, even though Anne is stricter with them than their mother is, there are various signs in Persuasion that the children actually do like Anne even better than their own mother, even though she's a disciplinarian. So actually, in both Werther and in Persuasion, the main character is loved by children, but it's a very, very different kind of love and a very, very different kind of relationship with children. And Anne would be extremely unlikely in Persuasion to suggest that she needs to be learning from these children. They need to be learning from her. But I draw attention to these scenes because it's easy and even accurate to draw from them some very sharp contrasts and overall values. Werther is as tender to his own inner child as he is of children. He sounds quite pleased when he describes how he, quote, puts in his claim to a good thing, that is latte. And you remember, she's engaged at this point and later married to his friend. But that does not stop Werther. He says, this is a quotation from the Sorrows of Young Werther, "What a child I am, to be so greedy for a look from her. What a child I am." And Austen's more skeptical, and some would say more realistic treatment of children suggests that not only children, but one's own inner child, meaning one's most immediate and even natural desires, need to be restrained in the social world. Werther would see disciplining children as spoiling their authentic natural virtues, and is more likely to feel that some of the most important virtues need to be acquired. But now, having looked at the treatment of children, I want to continue with Persuasion and look at how Austen treats the romantic values versus the earlier 18th century neoclassical values in other ways throughout her last novel. The first opposition that I've already mentioned is rationality versus passion. And there's that romantic emphasis on overflow rather than the restraint of strong feeling. I told you I'd come back to William Blake, that very long-lived both romantic precursor and romantic and revolutionary poet. And I'm quoting from Blake's Proverbs of Hell, quote, "Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires." We should not restrain our feelings. And he also has, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom." And also, and this is very important as a contrast with Austen, those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. So, in many ways, Jane Austen is critical of the cult of strong feeling, particularly as it filtered down into popular culture. A lot of what I am saying is not so much true of the romantic writers themselves, who are often very complicated in their treatment of these things. It's more the way that these ideas filtered down into popular culture and the way that people reacted to them and took them up in a very simplistic and unexamined way. And that, I think, is what Jane Austen is most critical of. She would criticize Blake, Proverbs above, particularly selfishness that fancied itself as strong feeling. There are several examples from Persuasion that seem particularly pertinent here. The sick child, the nephew that we've already seen, is so sick that there's a feeling that his mother should stay home from a party that she wants to go to. And she says, "Oh, I can't do that because I have such strong motherly feelings that I can't bear to be with my sick child because I suffer so much when I see him suffering." So Anne can stay with him because she doesn't have strong feelings. So I'll go to the party and Anne can stay. Well, clearly Jane Austen is making fun of this cult of strong feeling. The other one there are two others from Persuasion that I think are particularly wonderful. There's a character called Captain Benwick in Persuasion, and he's like a Byronic figure in that the woman he was engaged to has died. And when we meet him, he is just completely torn up. He can hardly speak to anybody. He goes off on long walks. He is suffering. He is just in terrible shape. And he meets Anne, and he immediately sort of perks up because he finds out that she reads the Romantic poets. She reads Byron. And they also talk a bit about Sir Walter Scott. And Lotte and Werther bond over liking the same books, so you immediately feel Captain Benwick beginning to perk up. But this doesn't play out in quite the way that the romantic Benwick would probably like it to. Anne disagrees with him to some degree about these romantic poets. The romantic authors in Britain tended to be poets. She likes Byron, but she doesn't believe that Benwick should wallow in Byronic grief. What the narrator calls impassioned descriptions of hopeless agony. And she says, I mean, well, you know, he's a sympathetic guy. He's lost his dearly loved fiancée. But she says, why don't you read a little less poetry and begin to read a little bit more prose, is what she says. And her goal, she says, don't read things that exacerbate your feelings, that make you feel worse, that intensify your grief. Read things that will tend to help you bear it. Werther, in the sorrows of young Werther, always reads to find his own emotions reflected and increased. Anne suggests that Benwick should do the opposite. Read sober prose works that will modify or at least allow him to endure his pain. And what about Captain Benwick's pain? Captain Benwick is a very interesting contrast to Anne. He's a gloomy, romantic figure in his grief that everybody feels sorry for. But in the end, his stronger feelings are far more changeable. Anne is deeply in love with Wentworth, who at this point in the novel is completely angry with her, is ignoring her. She's very sad and very depressed. I'll talk about that later. But no one knows it. You know, Benwick is ostentatiously suffering. But it turns out that within days, when another young woman, whom I'll talk about later, Louisa, has an accident in his vicinity and is laid up in the same house with him, they're engaged in an extraordinarily short time. So again, Jane Austen is taking these romantic values of agonizing, unendurable grief and giving them to a character who is re-engaged in a remarkably short period of time. Interesting, the person for whom grief, sorrow, and love persists the most is Anne, suggesting that the fact that she doesn't show her feelings does not mean that they're weaker. They're just less dramatized. The last example that I would give you is Anne's reaction when the young woman, Louisa, has the accident that I referred to. It's a fairly serious accident. She's knocked out. And the other women who are around, including Louisa's sister, have hysterics and they faint, and Anne copes. She figures out what to do physically, what needs to be done. And again, the suggestion is she can do this because she's phlegmatic. She's unfeeling. She doesn't have strong feelings. The novel, of course, undercuts that. I ask you also to notice this is exactly some of the accusations that have been made about Jane Austen. that she doesn't really understand strong feeling, the neat garden with borders, that the passions are perfectly unknown to her, that I quoted at the beginning from Charlotte Bronte. But in fact, it's very clear that Jane Austen does not believe that the fact that you can continue to function in the social world when you're in pain means that your pain is less strong or less real. I don't know if any of you have seen the film of Persuasion that was made a number of years ago. And during this time when Anne is truly suffering a tremendous amount, she's listening to everybody else's troubles. There's a scene in the film where one sister's complaining about the sister-in-law, and they're always complaining to Anne, and you just see her as a listening ear. So even though she herself is in tremendous pain, she is continuing to attend to her social duties, to the needs of others, to the needs of her nephew who is sick, and she can rise to the occasion even in an emergency when everyone else is too full of feeling to respond properly. So Anne's presence of mind in a crisis is not a sign that she's phlegmatic. Indeed, the claims to be incapacitated by strong feeling are often exploited and indicate the opposite in Jane Austen. So unlike William Blake, the Romantic poet, who said people who can restrain their feelings have weak feelings, rather for Jane Austen, as one of our contemporary poets puts it, the power of the genie comes from being contained in the bottle. When you read Persuasion, you feel Anne's pain all the more for the fact that it's almost completely unexpressed in any way, and no one knows anything about it. So I said that Jane Austen, unlike Blake, presents her characters as feeling more because they keep those feelings under restraint. So the vocabulary of gesture by which strong feeling can be expressed in her novels is in fact rather limited. And that's led sometimes to the charge of triviality. People don't do much, you will hear people say in her novel. Certainly compared to works ending in suicide, the plot of Persuasion seems rather uneventful. Anne and Wentworth do eventually get back together, but only after a very long and painful process. The actions available to Austen's characters can seem pitifully circumscribed by their social world. Moreover, the notion of Jane Austen as celebrating moderation, social decorum, prudence, rationality is at least complicated by this novel Persuasion, which features a heroine, quote, forced into prudence in her youth so that she learned romance as she grew older, the natural sequence of an unnatural beginning. At one point, Anne is wooed by her own cousin, who is, he's a real creep, but he's very decorous and very, he has excellent manners and he's very polite. And Anne thinks about him, there was never any burst of feeling, any warmth of indignation or delight at the good or evil of others. She felt that she could so much more depend upon the sincerity of those who sometimes looked or said a careless or hasty thing than of those whose presence of mind never varied, whose tongue never slipped. And remember, that's some people's view of Jane Austen. And she's specifically critiquing it there and saying, I don't want this guy who is always under perfect control. And rejecting him, she thinks, warmth and enthusiasm did captivate her still. Enthusiasm is a very loaded word because it's a word that's associated with the French Revolution. the enthusiasm that led to the French Revolution. Very charged, very loaded, very dangerous word. The second value that I'd like to talk about is the individual alone, or in nature, or the individual in society. Again, I remind you of the brooding Captain Benwick I described, unable when we first meet him to enjoy the company of other people, alone in his sorrow. And in contrast, Anne suffers emotional upheaval and distress at many points in the novels, while remaining not only outwardly calm, but continuing effectively to do her social duties, what Jane Austen would call the common civilities, attending to the needs of the occasion and of others. But emphasizing the ways in which Anne continues to respond to the concerns of others around her in the midst of her own pain, we might see the novel as anti-romantic. She doesn't go off in a dark, brooding funk, as a Byronic hero might do. But she is extremely alone. At the same time that she recognizes the claims of society, she's extremely lonely in her integrity and self-sufficiency. She does not share her mother is dead. She completely has different values from her father and her sister. Austen creates a character who is misunderstood by everyone around her, as Werther claims to be. She does not rhapsodize about nature in the way that Werther does in The Sorrows of Young Werther, but she nourishes herself with walks in the country. And being removed from the rural countryside to the artificial society of Bath in the novel is one of her hardships. The whole novel is permeated by what Anne thinks of as, quote, the influence so sweet and so sad of the autumnal months in the country. One of the saddest to me passages in Persuasion about Anne's complete being misunderstood, her complete loneliness, is a moment when she's playing music at a party. And the parents of the girls who are giving the party have enjoyed their children's playing on the piano. And then they say, oh, Anne, why don't you go play? And this is a passage from Persuasion. Anne knew that when she played, she was giving pleasure only to herself. But this was no new sensation. Excepting one short period of her life, she had never since the age of 14, never since the loss of her dear mother, known the happiness of being listened to or encouraged by any just appreciation or real taste. In music, she had been always used to feel alone in the world. And Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's fond partiality for their own daughter's performance and total indifference to any other person's gave her much more pleasure for their sakes than mortification for her own. For most of the novel, I would describe Anne Elliot as depressed. I think this is the first portrayal of long-term, low-grade depression that I know of in the novel. Werther, in The Sorrows of Young Werther, is certainly depressed and also exuberant, but his depression is anything but long-term and low-grade. He commits suicide at the end. He makes sure that others hear about his pain. But the fact that Anne's depression is hardly spoken about in the book does not make it less. Werther believes his suicide shows his pain is great because it's unbearable. The fact that Anne bears her pain does not reduce its severity for Austen. She's not just separated from Wentworth, she's alone in the very deepest sense. There's no one else around her that she can talk to. And there's another moment that always moves me in Persuasion. This is what Virginia Woolf said about Jane Austen, sort of responding to the charge that not very much happens in Jane Austen's novel. she says, yeah, that's true. They always act within social decorum. Nobody, but there comes a moment which rises higher than the rest, which though not eloquent in itself, or violent, or made striking by beauty of language, has the whole weight of the book behind it. In Jane Austen, too, we have the same sense, though the ligatures are much less tight, that our figures are bound and restricted to a few definitive moments. There's a little moment like that in Persuasion. She's walking with a group of people, including Wentworth and the woman she thinks Wentworth is now in love with, to visit another cousin. And she sort of speaks up. They've all gone off on their own. And Anne says, is not this one of the ways to Winthrop? But nobody heard, or at least nobody answered her. It's very small, but that one little moment where she sort of speaks out into the air and there's no one around to hear or to respond is very telling in the whole context with the whole weight of the book behind it. So, in spite of the fact that Anne and Wentworth do get together at the end, there's been a lot of pain. They've lost 7 years, and as the critic A. Walton Litt said, in spite of the happy ending, the deepest impression we carry away from Persuasion is one of human isolation. So I would argue that in that way, Persuasion does deal with one of the major themes of the Romantic movement, human isolation, not man in society. And finally, whether we find our nature within the social world or whether civilization distorts our true nature, Austen clearly, of course, believes that admirable people continue to function in the social world despite their private pain. But she is not uncritical of traditional Tory landholding society. She, too, is looking at her social world critically and its change in societal relations. She's no working class revolutionary, but she not only accurately observes the trend in her society of money beginning to replace rank as a basis for distinction and place in society, but she's not against that change. I mentioned that, and it may indicate, making money may indicate personal worth. Captain Wentworth, the noble lover in Persuasion, is said to exceed by his exertion, not by inheriting property. Wentworth has made £20,000 in prize money. And Anne, at the end of the novel, believes she should have trusted more to his abilities and exertion than being overly cautious. It's Anne's father, Sir Walter, who is a titled member of the gentry, who objects to the Navy, which is the profession portrayed very positively throughout Persuasion, and in which Jane Austen's, as I mentioned, loved brothers belong, and which she followed eagerly. Sir Walter, the father of Anne, the snobbish father of Anne, the aristocratic Sir Walter, objects to the Navy because, quote, it's the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction and raising men to honors which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamt of. But the whole motion of Persuasion starts because Sir Walter has to rent out his ancestral house to a naval family, the Cross, because Sir Walter has wasted money so thoroughly and been so improvident that he can't afford to live there anymore, and he has to rent it out to someone who's made a lot of money in the Navy. And Anne comes to feel, these Navy people deserve this a lot more than my father does, because he's improvident and he's wasteful, and these landed gentry aren't doing what they should. Yo, Navy, let's see them move on up. So in conclusion, it's with a shock that in some ways, though not in others, we might describe Anne Elliot as a heroine fully in keeping with some of the themes of the Romantic movement. A woman alone, misunderstood by those around her, possessing a deep feeling for nature, suffering from a seemingly hopeless love, a being whose nature is essentially constrained by the artificial social world around her. Thank you.
Okay, who has questions or comments? Oh, Michael. Good.
First, thank you very much. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Two questions. First, suggestions for further reading. For instance, could maybe a biography to read?
I would suggest, actually, if you're interested in what this talk is about, there's a book from 1979. Let me get the exact title. Jane Austen and the French Revolution. And it was one of the first books that began to question this notion of how little she had seemed to have to do with the events of her time. It's by a man named Warren Roberts, and that would be, I would think, a good place to start.
A quick second question. I really enjoyed the notion of the hidden romantic, as it were.
Oh yeah.
And it seems another obvious case, perhaps, are the Dashwood sisters in Sense and Sensibility. You have Mary Ann, she can't possibly fall in love with somebody who isn't, and she almost ends up killing herself. On the other hand, you have Eleanor, who's suffering just as much as she is, but in total silence, and is the one who's getting her family through all of this.
Absolutely. And, those themes are absolutely there in Sense and Sensibility. Those terms are really more from the novel of Feeling a little in the 18th century. But one of the interesting things, I think, is how often Jane Austen turns back on herself. Because as you point out, Mary Ann and her romantic cult of feeling, she is undercut thoroughly by much that happens in the novel. But Eleanor, who we might think of as the sister who restrains herself, moderation, etc., she doesn't get the love of her life until a moment when she uncharacteristically somewhat speaks out. And that's actually rather typical of Jane Austen. Wentworth and Anne Elliot only get together because Wentworth overhears, and Anne means for him to overhear, Anne talking about how women's feelings for their loves last longer than men's. So I guess what I'm saying is often the characters who are admirable because they do, in important ways, don't dramatize their feelings, they restrain them, but they also have to learn often to express those feelings, to have them come out and to reach out for what they want, or they won't get it. So it's an interesting interplay. There's often a way, I think, in which, having set up the sisters as the sister of passion, the sister of rationality, she complicates those things. And of course, in the end, Mary Ann makes the rather sensible marriage to the older man, having almost died for a far more imprudent love. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question. There are more than 300 spin-offs and contemporary rewrite. What's going on? Why are there so many people here doing this?
I have no idea. I think we'd have to ask. But I think Jane Austen. How many of you here would consider yourself a Janeite? Yeah. Okay. Jane Austen. I mean, I know many people who reread all of Jane Austen every year. Those 6 novels. I would have to let people speak for themselves. I love Jane Austen. I could tell you why I love Jane Austen. But she's definitely a writer that inspires intense loyalty and fascination and love among a certain group of people. There are other people, of course, who have no use for Jane Austen. I find it very interesting when I teach Jane Austen to see the various reactions in my class, from those who consider her trivial to those who immediately fall in love with her. But you tell me, why are so many? If you reread Jane Austen every year, why? What brings you back? What is it that makes her?
I think it's because they're sort of like family, and they're people you know, and you meet other people who read Jane Austen. You can talk about, well, when Jane said that to Elizabeth, what do you think she really meant? So I think that's why. Now the 300 spin-offs, I don't know why people read those.
I think they're hoping to get some bit of, those novels are over. They're not going to be any more. So the best you can do is reach for the spin-offs. But that feeling you're describing of her ability to do what the 18th century valued, which is hold up the mirror to life in such a way that it still seems recognizable as things and people that you know all this time later is truly remarkable. Whereas you might read some of the great romantic poets because they express the most private feeling you ever have at 3 a.m. in the morning that you never tell anyone, which is a different reason to read and a different reason to value writers. Yeah.
I think that people who are fans of the movies are a little bit different than people who are fans of the novels. And I think that if you haven't read the books, you have a very different feel for what Jane Austen is. Because why I reread Jane Austen is for the voice of her as a narrator. I say to my students that she's sort of invented snark. Because she's very ironic and funny, and every time you read it, you notice another turn of phrase where she, insults someone without like she speaks right to their face and says something that sounds like a compliment, and it's really not a compliment. I mean, that's the beauty of it, and it's so rich, and every time you read it, you notice something a little different. But just her voice and her way of narrating, I think, is what is really masterful.
The claw in the velvet glove. Yeah. I actually think that something that Jane Austen herself wrestled with a bit was her desire both for generosity and for compassion, and for the fact that she had a really wonderful and wicked sense of humor that at times can be very shocking, even to us now. In Persuasion, for example, the main family that Anne is hanging out with, the Musgroves, they've lost a son in the war. But there's this remarkable paragraph by the narrator in which she said, well, they probably liked him a lot better dead than they did when he was alive, because he was basically really worthless. And, this is very characteristic of families in which once somebody is dead, they become the sainted son. And Wentworth, who was his commanding officer, has to kind of sort of say nice things about him. But it's a devastating, you probably know that paragraph very well, but it's one of the more sort of shocking things. I think in this way, maybe Jane Austen is a little bit like Emma, who makes that really nasty crack about Miss Bates, for which she is criticized by Mr. Knightley because it's unkind. And I've always thought that was Jane Austen thinking, yeah, I say a lot of unkind, but I'm witty and they're true, and that's what people are really like. But it really can be sort of unkind, so I have to really sort of balance that out.
So for me, it's more about how incredibly fair she is. She's and observant, and everybody is like that. You know, I think sometimes people get involved in, because she shapes the context so beautifully, right? The context is all there, and then I think it's easy for people to get so involved in the context that they miss the actual interactions between the human characters, all of which happen in, I would believe, in most societies all the time. But in a way, by placing him in such an exact context, it sort of makes it, I don't know how to say it exactly, it makes it more universal because it's so specific. And the other thing I just wanted to say was thank you, because Persuasion is my favorite book in the world.
Oh.
And I don't read it every year.
Yeah.
I read it another year. You know, but yeah, no.
What do you love about it? Why do you?
Because the only thing that Anne, I'm going to cry too, so sorry. It's her good heart. The only thing that Anne has going for her is her good heart.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a very sad book.
Yeah.
But I think, despite the...
But she does
the
get a happy ending.
She gets a happy ending,
So.
yeah. Right.
Remind me about romance or lack of in Jane Austen's own life.
Oh, there have been in biographies and lots of speculation, I guess I would say. One of the tales is that she was attracted to a young Irishman at a dance, and they showed their feelings in public, and afterwards everybody was horribly embarrassed when she was young. Later, this is in fact documented and true. She was proposed to by the rather wealthy young man whose father had given the ball at which that other incident occurred, and she accepted him, and then the next day reneged and backed out of that. A lot of her biographers feel that when she was young, she loved to dance. She was fun. She was something of a social butterfly. But particularly as she had a lot of brothers, as she saw her sister-in-laws bearing children and being sort of weighed down literally by that and worn out, that she became considerably less romantic. Her sister Cassandra, there's a feeling that she was in love with someone who died. So there have been a lot of attempts to sort of create a hopeless love for Jane Austen, or to develop, partly because people just can't believe that she could write so well about things without having these experiences herself. Again, this feeling the passions are perfectly unknown to her. If you reread Emma, for example, you'll notice very small things. Emma is always physically aware of where Mr. Knightley is in the room. Even before she realizes she's in love with him, she knows where he's looking. Very, very tiny, small things. And yet she's able to capture the small physical awareness of somebody that you're attracted to, and just a very wasn't Mr. Knightley? Oh, he was right over there. She knows where he was in the room. So the short answer is I don't think anybody really knows, but there's been a lot of speculation. Yeah.
You offered a quote early on. Thank you. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. First of all, was that offered as a straight statement, or was it sarcastic?
No. Now, that is from the Proverbs of Hell. So again, this is partly what I meant by saying and drawing some of these broad contrasts. Within the Romantic writers themselves, they're often much more complex, both offered and also examined and critiqued. But the point is, these things filtered down in a more unexamined and simplified way. It's an extreme statement. I think Blake was, shall we say, tossing it out there as a challenge.
The reason
That doesn't mean he accepted it or he didn't feel that it wasn't also a dangerous sentiment. But he was a revolutionary, and he had a lot of sympathy with lack of staying in the straight and narrow and social decorum.
The reason it fit into what I'm studying recently about, this is sort of a statement of the American culture, so I wanted to get more sense of it.
I'm sorry?
That the statement fits a description of the American culture, so I wanted to get it.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Any other questions?
I'm afraid we've about come to the end of our time.
All right.
But
Well, thank you so much.
thank you for sharing
This
Jane
was
Austen.
wonderful. We did have a big display of books by and about Jane Austen. Many of them have been checked out. So, but I do invite you to take a look at that. There's been a plethora of books about things that people have learned, life lessons that people have learned from Jane Austen. So we have a few of those over there as well.